Shalom and welcome back to another Torah video here in the Pilgrim Youth channel. My name is Elizabeth Denicio and let's continue with our studies in the book of Genesis or Bereshit, chapters 29 from verse 31 to 35, chapters 30 and 31. And the title for today's study is The Origin of a Chosen People. But before we begin, let's recap a little bit of what we learned last week. And what we learned last week, we started looking and analyzing into the life of the patriarch Yaakov, who, although his life was full of obstacles and challenges, he demonstrated to be a man who believed and clinged firmly in the covenant of his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham, that they agreed with the Eternal. We saw that he was a man who was deemed as being tamim, that we find this reference in the concordance, Strong's Concordance, 8,549, and it means to be complete, entire, perfect, but not perfect as the way that we think of it today, as a person who has no faults or flaws or defects. However, a person who is whole, who is full in the understanding and obedience to the Eternal's commandments, a person who is finished, well-rounded, balanced, sincere, and wholehearted to the responsibilities and expectations that the Eternal is waiting from his children to live by. Due to his righteous and perseverant character to uphold the Eternal's covenant and promise, the Eternal allowed him to see in a dream the stairway that connected earth and heaven, and where he saw malachim, or angels of the Eternal, going up and down on it. This, as we learned last week, was a shadow of Yeshua, our Mashiach, who is the door, the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through him, as we see it in John 14:16. From that point on, Yaakov personally recognizes the Eternal of his fathers as his own, and also receiving the promise that the Almighty was going to be with him, that he was going to be taking care of him, and that the Eternal was going to supply all of Yaakov's needs along the way in his pilgrimage back to the Promised Land. Because as we know, he had to leave his home because his brother Esau was very upset and wanted to kill him. So therefore, he arrived in Padam Aram this week, as he was indicated by his parents. His mother and his father told him to go there. And there we saw that he was introduced to Rachel and Leah, as we know that they're daughters of his uncle Laban. And we see that Laban asked for him to stay. Yaakov went to the land of his mother Rivka to find a wife among them, and worked 7 years for his bride Rachel. But as we all know, Laban gave the eldest Leah to him instead. Betrayed by Laban, Yaakov had to work another 7 years if he wanted to marry Rachel as well. Scriptures depict Yaakov's married life as one filled with rivalry between the two sisters, as we will see in we will continue to see in today's study. And although we know that this was not the Eternal's plan from the beginning, for a man to have two wives, as we see it in Genesis 2:24, that only one woman and one man shall unite and become one flesh. That was really what the Eternal wanted. But the Eternal allowed this to happen because this would bring forth the birth of a nation that was going to be set apart in this world, a nation where Yeshua our Mashiach would be born from, and a nation that has and continues to be the representation of a holy people, but not in the literal form as we would think, but people who have through the ages voluntarily turned away from a life of sin and begin to live a life in obedience, a complete submission to the will of the Eternal Father. And through the life of the patriarchs, we come to understand that the Eternal uses people like you and I to bring forth his plan. With all our weaknesses and shortcomings, the Eternal is merciful and patient. And well, let's start going into chapter 29, verse 31. We see that although it may be a little strange to us as to why the Eternal allowed this whole thing that Yaakov had 2 wives and all of this happen in the patriarch's life, we must also remember that everything that the Eternal allows in our life is for a reason. For Leah, Rachel or Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah was we know, or we're going to find out, we're going to see that the 12 tribes were formed. From each tribe, the Eternal had a purpose. These two women, as in Leah and Rachel, represented the 2 future houses of Israel through Yeshua. Rachel represents the multiplicity of all nations through Ephraim, her future grandson, and Leah represented the house of Judah due to the authority given to the tribe in Genesis 49:10. It was obvious to all, including Leah, that Yaakov loved Rachel, or Rachel, much more than her. Perhaps in Yaakov's actions and mannerisms of indifference, she proved that this was the case. So we will start beginning reading from verse 31 to 32, and it says, "Now Adonai saw that Leah was unloved, so he opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to conceive. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son and named him Reuben, because she said, 'For Adonai has seen my affliction. Surely now my husband will love me.'" The Eternal recognized Leah as Yaakov's legitimate wife and saw her affliction caused by Yaakov's rejection towards her. The Eternal approved of their marriage and opened Leah's womb so that she could have a child. This was a way in which the Eternal gave Leah joy, that is, happiness in her circumstance. The opposite happened for Rachel. The Almighty decided to close her womb, and she was sterile and could not have children. It is amazing to me in this portion that how the Eternal is the one who decides when and where does new life come forth in this life. It really made me see the aspect that really the Eternal has full control over all of us, all over our bodies, and has control of all of the things that happen in our lives, as we will see in the example of this patriarch who literally teaches us how that imperfect people as they were, just like we are, the Eternal continues to use this family to bring forth a nation that not only symbolized humanity, but also is a representation of what Yeshua is going to come and gather, the remnant of Israel. So we see that nothing escapes the Eternal's eye. It's amazing. Leah named her firstborn child Reuven, which means, "See, here is a son." And as we remember that all of the names in Hebrew, all of the names that were given to children or people were a reflection of who they were or a message that they wanted to impart. And here, Reuven means here, see, here is a son. As a way, I think, to remember or to remind Yaakov that he would carry his name and legacy, and perhaps this time, maybe Leah would gain Yaakov's affection and attention. And Leah thought that Yaakov's feelings would change towards her by providing him with offspring, because men usually expect when you get married or you unite your life with a person is to have children, and these children are the ones who carry your legacy, that carry the name and all of the teachings that we carry down from generation to generation. However, we saw that was not the case. In verse 33 to 35, we continue to see how scriptures tells us that the Eternal continued to allow Leah to have more children to give to Yaakov. Leah then had Shimeon, which means heard, for the Eternal heard her prayers because she was still being rejected. Then she gave birth to Levi, which means attached or to hold. I think to hold, meaning to hoping that this time, Yaakov can come and become attached to her through bonding with their children. Leah's eagerness for affection and approval diverted her attention away from the eternal and focused more on the rejection or that emotion that she was receiving from Yaakov. She became absorbed by it. Although she didn't choose to be in the situation where I'm pretty sure if she had the choice in the moment I think she also had a choice, but the Eternal allowed this to happen because of a reason, and we already know it's because the Eternal was going to create this new nation. But she per se didn't choose to be in the situation of not being loved by the person that she loved him. So I think let us not forget that Yaakov worked 7 years for Rachel, where I'm pretty sure that not only Rachel was watching, but I think Leah was also looking at the integrity, the honesty, the uprightness of Yaakov's character, and I think that's what probably won her over as well. And I think she legitimately loved Yaakov as well. But as we see that in the situation, Yaakov didn't correspond her feelings, so she probably felt rejected, and not probably, she did feel despised by Yaakov. So the Eternal allowed this to happen, and this kind of reminded me of a similar situation that happened to a person who didn't necessarily choose that path, and that person is Job. And we know that Job is a man who was deemed as blameless and upright, one who feared Adonai and spurned evil. And we see that Adonai allowed that the adversary to touch every aspect of his life, like his children, money, relationships, property, his health, etc. But Satan could not kill him. He couldn't touch his life. Job did nothing to deserve these tragedies and curses that fell upon him, but even when he went through painful emotional situations, as I think we can also see that Leah went through this, he did not sin, nor did he murmur against the Almighty. He accepted it. He said he accepted the situation, and he knew that the Eternal was behind it all, because he knew also that where he was in his spiritual life. So we see that he tells his wife, who told him to curse Elohim and then die. We see in Job 2 verse 10, he said to her, his wife, "You speak as a foolish woman would speak. Should we accept the good from Elohim and not accept the bad?" Through all this, Job did not sin with his lips. It is amazing to see that Job truly loved the Eternal, because he knew that not only do we receive the good things from the Eternal, but also the things, the tests that the Eternal allows us to pass for our own benefit. And if we truly love the Eternal, we must accept everything he allows in our lives, whether we think they're good things or whether we think they're bad or not benefiting us at all. We have to do just like Job did, accept the will of the Eternal in our lives. The Eternal wants all of our affection. He wants all of our attention and effort to submit fully to his will in our life. Leah, after continuing to worry about and trying to gain the affection of Yaakov, she finally, through her son Judah, was able to really, she stopped focusing on those emotional ties and trying to be corresponded with love, and instead we see that she named her son, which she conceived again, Judah, which means to celebrate an exaltation. And this is to say that this time she was going to exalt the Almighty for his favor, benevolence, and goodness, despite not having Yaakov's approval or love. Now we're going to go down to chapter 30, and we're going to read chapter 30, verses 1 to 3, and it says, "When Rachel saw that she bore no children for Jacob, Rachel was jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, 'Give me sons. If there are none, I'll die.' But Jacob became furious with Rachel and said, 'Am I instead of God? Am I instead of God, the one who withheld you from the fruits of your womb? So she said, here is my maidservant Bilhah. Go to her and let her give birth on my knees, so that from her I may also build a family. Rachel was still sterile, and she was carried away by her feelings, and even worse, by her envy against her sister, demands her husband to give her children or else she would die. Here we see the human part of Rachel. In fact, both of not only Rachel but also her sister, as they were competing to see who would give Jacob more children. This may seem a little strange to the average woman of today, because as we know today, wanting children and wanting children at all, or wanting to pass the husband's name down and continue, is really ridiculous. It's a ridiculous matter for a lot of women for today, of all of this feminism that's going on. But in that era, especially in the time of the patriarchs, it was vital. It was so important, giving a child to the patriarch that would, especially a male child, who would be responsible for the next offspring that were going to come in the lineage, that were going to continue to be in the will of the Eternal and continue to teach the Torah and continue to be that clean lineage for Yeshua to be able to come through that lineage. Jacob became upset, as we already saw, at Rachel for her demands, and reminds her that she did not have children because he could not physically provide her with one, since we already know that Leah had 4 children already, but that it was the Eternal's will that Rachel should not have children at the time, at that moment. However, Rachel's real motive for demanding a child was for her to give her maiden servant Bilhah to Yaakov for a wife, and through her have a child. The phrase "bear a child on my knees" in verse 3 refers to the ancient practice of surrogate adoption. Rachel was essentially saying that any child born to Bilhah would be placed upon Rachel's knees, thus signifying that Rachel, not Bilhah, would be recognized as the mother, according to the custom of the time. And we see the same practice, or we see that the matriarch Sarah also did that same action and decided to do the same. From verses 4 to 8, Bilhah conceives a son, which she names Dan, which means judge, where the Eternal heard her cause and passed judgment and favored her. Then her maidservant conceived again, and another son was born, which they named Naphtali, meaning my wrestling, which refers to the wrestling against her sister Leah, and she won favor, which we see that confirms that sentiment of rivalry, competitiveness between her and her sister. In verse 9, now Leah saw that she stopped having children, so she took Zilpah, her female servant, and gave her to Yaakov as a wife. After seeing that her sister Rachel's maiden was conceiving and giving Yaakov more sons, her sister Leah wanted to also present Yaakov with more children. Leah also gave her servant Zilpah, as we saw, and also claimed those children. Zilpah bore 2 more sons, and she named them Gad, which means happiness, and the other Asher, which means blessed. When the Torah, we see that these practices and all this rivalry was caused because of all of this disorder. But we see that when the Torah was given in the written form to Moshe, the Eternal placed laws within the nation to prevent situations that would create these kind of environments, these hostile and unfair environments that Leah and Rachel were experiencing. We see this in Leviticus 18:18 and Deuteronomy 21 from verse 15 to 17. And let's continue with verse 14 to verse 15 in chapter 30. It says, now during the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, wasn't it enough that you took my husband away? You'd also take away my son's mandrakes? So Rachel said, "That being so, let him lie with you tonight. I'll exchange for your son's mandrakes." When we read from verse 14 to 15 that Reuben, the eldest of Leah's sons, went to the field to find some mandrakes in the field, it is frequently said that these fruits or these herbs that he went to go get increased fertility. That's why we see that Rachel had a great interest, that she actually negotiated that Yaakov go sleep with his sister. That's how much she wanted these rare herbs that she thought was going to help her be more fertile. But we see that at the end she remained barren. She continued to be sterile, and we see that although these two women negotiated between themselves, when Leah and Yaakov, when they slept together, they conceived, and Leah became pregnant with her fifth child, who she called Issachar, and from verse 16 to 21. And his name means he has rewarded, meaning the Eternal has rewarded. After a long time not being able to bear more children, Leah was rejoiced to have Issachar. Then we know that Zebulon was conceived, and his name means Elohim has presented me a good gift. As we see that Leah was having great appreciation and gratitude to the Eternal for another gift granted to her. And then at the end we see that Dinah, a daughter, was born also to Yaakov. Surely in the face of all the pressure that Rachel experienced due to her sterility, every day she cried out to, imagine that every day she prayed to the Eternal, she cried to the Eternal for a son. And that's why we see that in verse 22 to 24, it says, "Then Elohim remembered Rachel, and Elohim listened to her and opened her womb. Then she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She said, Elohim has taken my disgrace. She named him Joseph, saying, may Adonai add another son for me." At last, it was the right time in the plan of the Eternal to let Rachel conceive a child. I think the Eternal knew that once Rachel would give Yaakov a child from together, his life would probably feel complete. Having the woman that he loved and that he worked for 14 years, and now having a son who would carry his name and fulfill all the responsibilities. Rachel named her son Joseph, which means let him add. She thought that the Eternal had already allowed her to conceive once, and she hoped that he would be good and merciful to give her at least one more child. From here, our attention starts to shift from Yaakov's internal personal life and relationships with his wives, and we see the shift towards his relationship with his father-in-law, Laban. And we know that this man, Laban, is characterized as being an egocentric, a businessman who sought materialistic gain at any cost, and he was very cunning. This time, Yaakov the Eternal was calling him to leave Padam Aram and to go back to the Promised Land. However, we see how over and over in verses 25 to 43, how Laban became an obstacle for Yaakov to leave and fulfill his calling. Laban acknowledged he acknowledged the Eternal. He wasn't all ignorant to seeing the Eternal's hand, because we see that in the upcoming verses that he saw that the Eternal was upon his house and property because of Jacob, and he knew that as soon as Jacob would leave, the blessing will also go with him. Cunningly, Laban said in verses 27 to 31, it says, Laban said to him, "Please let me say something. I know that Elohim has blessed me because of you. Tell me what I should pay you, and I will give it to you." Yaakov answered, You know that I have worked hard for you. Your flock have grown and been well while I cared for them. 30. When I came, you had little. Now you have much, much more. Every time I did something for you, the Elohim blessed you. Now it is time for me to work for myself. It is time to do things for my family. 31. Laban asked, then what should I give you? It was clear that the Eternal was keeping his promise to Yaakov to take care and provide him with everything he needed. Adonai prospered Yaakov's touch, meaning everything that he did, and we know that he did it in integrity. The Eternal was there to bless him for it. This was also true of his son Joseph when he was in Egypt. If we later on in the chapters, as we continue to finish the book of Bereshit, we will see in chapter 39 verse 1 to 6 when the Eternal, it says in verse 2 that the Eternal helped Joseph become a successful man. Verse 3 says, Potiphar, an Egyptian man, governor, saw that Elohim was with Joseph, and that Elohim helped Joseph to be successful in everything he did. So we see that the same thing, how the Eternal prospered everything Jacob and Joseph did, not because they were privileged or because the Eternal loved them more, but it was because of their obedience to the Eternal. They believed in the Eternal's word and lived in rectitude and integrity. They were light to the people around them in their testimony of life. And both Laban and Potiphar recognized that their wealth came from the Eternal and not from Jacob or Joseph themselves. This teaches us a great lesson. When Yeshua told us in Matthew 5, verse 14 to 16, that all who believe in him and demonstrates it in the life of obedience to the word of the Father are considered a light to this world that is darkened by sin. A town built on a hill that can't be hidden. No matter what Yaakov or Joseph wore exteriorly or which position they had, as they were slaves and they were workmen, their testimony shined so bright that Laban and Potiphar, who were in that time higher rank than they were, saw the good and abundant hand of the Eternal. Our life should also be the same, that people in the world may see the Eternal's hand in our life, and everything we are becoming is because of him, and not because of our own selves, but because of him. Then we continue and we see that Laban confronted with the news that his best worker wanted to leave, and with all of the things that he had done for him, he did everything in his power to keep him from leaving. When he agreed to pay Yaakov with every lamb with spots or stripes, every black young goat, and every female goat with stripes or spots as his salary, Laban hid them away from Yaakov at a 3-day distance, so Yaakov won't take them. And here we see again his nature, his cunning nature, him wanting to gain anything for himself, and he was only thinking about himself. This action was not overlooked by Adonai, as we see that in Jeremiah 16 verse 17 says, For my eyes are on all of their ways. They are not hidden from my face, nor is their iniquity concealed from my eyes. Everything Laban did to take advantage of Yaakov and prevent him from leaving was all seen by the Almighty. And by the end of the next chapter, we will see how the Eternal took away all of his materials and gave them to Jacob. Yaakov, noticing the cunningness of Laban, began to use green branches from an almond tree on the strong animals, so that the young flock can be born strong, healthy, spotted, striped, or black. In verse 43, it says, In this way, Yaakov became very rich. He had large flocks, many servants, camels, and donkeys. And we see here then that Proverbs 11:20 was fulfilled, where the Eternal says, it says that those with perverse hearts, a perverted heart, are an abomination to Adonai. His favor is on those blameless in their ways. 21. But be sure The evil will not go unpunished, but the offspring of the righteous will be delivered. The Eternal definitely delivered Yaakov from the deceitfulness of Laban. In the next chapter, Yaakov reveals that this idea of using the green branches from an almond tree was actually a revelation that he received from the Eternal in a dream. And for me, this section was amazing to see how the Eternal truly takes care of his children who trust and believe in his word, and because of this trust, because of this belief that they have in the word, they act upon it. They are obedient to the Eternal. That's why we see that Yeshua said in Matthew 6:33, "But seek ye first the kingdom of Elohim and his righteousness, and all of the things shall be added unto you." And we see that this was true in Yaakov's life and all of the patriarchs' life. So many people will come up in our life that are like Laban, who can appear in our life, who will walk into our life, and who are full of who are wanting to prevent us to get closer to the Eternal, to make true teshuvah to the Eternal, and will want us to keep us in their slavery, in the sin state. But we must remember, and we need to see the example of Jacob, of how he was fully secure in the Eternal, that he put all of his confidence, all of his fidelity, all of his support in the Eternal, who he knew was going to protect them, who the Eternal promised that he was going to supply everything he needed. And we see that this same promise could have been for even Laban, but we see that although Laban had so many years to do teshuvah, to see the testimony of Yaakov, but we saw that he continued to see that gain. He didn't want to die to that way of living, and he just loved the materialistic things of this life. He loved money, he liked having a lot of possessions, and because of that, his heart became stubborn, and he afflicted Yaakov, and he afflicted him because he wanted to take advantage of him. But we saw that the Eternal saved him. And now we're going to go to chapter 31, where we're going to read verse 1-3, and it says, "One day Jacob heard Laban's son talking. They said, 'Jacob has taken everything that our father owned. He has become rich, and he has taken all this wealth from our father.' 2. Then Jacob noticed that Laban was not as friendly as he had been in the past. 3. Then Elohim said to Jacob, 'Go back to your own land where your ancestors lived. I will be with you.'" Jacob noticed Laban and his sons' change of attitude towards him. They were jealous of him because of how Adonai had prospered him, and probably demonstrated their sentiments by being curt, being rude, and this is something that Jacob did notice. They saw how each goat and sheep were either spotted, striped, or black, and that was very upsetting for them because that was the agreement. Yaakov seeing this, he calls his wives and tells them to gather by the field. And we see what happens in verses 5-7, and it says, "I have noticed that your father is not as friendly with me as he used to be, but Elohim of my father has been with me. You both know that I have worked as hard as I could for your father, but he cheated me. He changed my pay 10 times. But during all this, Elohim protected me from all of Laban's tricks." Yaakov began to inform Leah and Rachel of the changes that he saw in his father towards him, and told them that Elohim of Yaakov's father, had protected him from all of Laban's attempts to trick him, and that the Eternal was calling him back, and that they would have to leave. He told them to remember how, because they were witnesses of Yaakov's testimony of how his work ethic and how he really was with his father. And he told them that he worked integrally and had faithfulness he was faithful and honest all of those years that he had worked for Laban. And both Leah and Rachel knew that. Due to his faithful and righteous character, the Eternal continued to reveal instruction through a malach, or as we know it as an angel of the Almighty, which we know is Yeshua, who is an agent of the Eternal that gave him direction to protect Yaakov from Laban's subtle trickery. Verse 14, and here it also lets us know how the Eternal sees everything. Truly, nothing escapes the eyes of the Eternal. In verse 14 and 16, it tells us that both Leah and Rachel were already being treated differently by their father. That, in verse 15, it says, he treated them like strangers. He sold us, it says, to you, and then he spent all the money that should have been ours. 16, Adonai took all this wealth from our father, and now it belongs to us and our children. So you should do whatever Elohim told you to do. They recognized that Yaakov's righteous, they knew Yaakov's character. And they also knew the character of their father, and even saw his deeds that showed that he truly did not have their best interest in mind for them. And they agreed to leave their father, they agreed to leave their home, to go and do the travels and journey all the way back to the land of Canaan. They followed their husband to his land. We see that Yaakov, with their consent and their approval, Yaakov arose and was preparing to leave with all of his things, his family, his servants, his flocks, and everything that belonged to him. He took everything without letting Laban know. Before Rachel left, she stole the idols that belonged to her father, and Yaakov did not know that this happened. This is going to eventually bring a consequence. But we'll see what verse 22 to 24 says. 3 days later, Laban learned that Yaakov had run away. So he had gathered his men together and began to chase Jacob. After 7 days, Laban found Jacob near the hillside of Gilead. That night, Elohim came to Laban in a dream and said, be careful of every word that you say to Yaakov. I think Laban was so shocked and probably upset that Yaakov had gone without notifying him, and he probably felt humiliated and cheated, but he wanted, and that's why he began going after him. Once again, we see how the Eternal placed a limit to Laban and warned him to be careful in doing or saying anything to his servant Yaakov, that the Eternal was by his side, and be careful. He saw that Yaakov was a righteous man. And even though he was upset, and as it seems that he was ready to fight, since he took his soldiers and went to confront Yaakov, he was being rebellious to the Eternal, although he knew he had a limit, but he still wanted to see how he can take advantage of the situation. But the Eternal, this reminded me of the same warning that the Eternal gave to Pharaoh, in not becoming an obstacle for the nation of Israel to leave Egypt to serve the Elohim. And here we see that Laban had Pharaoh same spirit, since kind of like Laban didn't want to let them go, and Jacob had to leave because the Eternal was telling him to go. So we see that both Laban and Pharaoh were obstacles to the pilgrimage of the nation of Israel. And this lesson we see that is the same for us. That although we may have people in our life that wants to depart and prevent us from following the Eternal completely, by their comments or by telling us that we don't know, we're not smart enough, or we don't know what we're doing because we're young, or we don't know what we want because we're young, we see that the Eternal will intervene. He will have our backs in the time where things are out of control and we can't have control. Just like Yaakov couldn't have control over Laban, but the Eternal had control over Laban, and he warned him to be careful with his servant. We see that the Eternal is real, and he will preserve our life to fulfill his purpose in our life as well. When Laban finally caught up to Yaakov in the hillside country of Gilead, he stopped them and inquired why they had left so unexpectedly. Yaakov expressed concern that Laban would have retained his daughters and grandchildren from him, since he knew already what Laban was capable of. Laban, still indignant of Yaakov's decision to leave, he accused them of kind of like wanting to go through his things to see if he took anything. And Yaakov said, "You can check up. I don't have anything of yours." And he searched for anything that might have been stolen. This was an action of humiliating Yaakov, because Laban knew very well that Yaakov had worked for him many years honestly and earnestly. He knew that Yaakov wouldn't do something like that. Not knowing that Rachel has taken the idol, in verse 34, Yaakov said, "Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live." In front of our relatives, identify whatever is yours that is with me and take it back. By this declaration is why many believe that this caused Rachel's early death. In verse 36, then Yaakov got angry and argued with Laban. Yaakov answered and said to Laban, What is my crime? What is my sin that you've hotly pursued me? Why are you chasing me? We see that Yaakov begins to remind Laban of his integrity and confronts him with his life that was irreproachable and blameless. Laban had nothing to say about his character. Yaakov continued to reproach Laban of his actions and said in verse 42, "Had I not had the Elohim of my father, the Elohim of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed now. But Elohim saw my misery and the toil of my hands, and last night he became the judge." Laban, I think, became enraged by Yaakov's words, continued to say that Yaakov's wives and his children belonged to him, and that everything that Yaakov had was because of him. Laban was so attached to his belongings that he started to say things that were so absurd and ridiculous. This, of course, we know that was not true. Yaakov had worked very hard for everything he had. He fulfilled every step with truth and honesty. At the end, Laban had no other choice than to let them go. He had nothing against Yaakov, and this teaches us a big lesson, that us as believers have to live the high standard that the Eternal is asking us. We are called to live a life that will exalt our Heavenly Father's name among the nations and be that light in the world where people are dead in their sins, that people live in their darkness of a sinful life. We must live a life that is clean and correct before the Eternal so that we can be found irreproachable. To conclude, we see in Leviticus 20, verse 26, it says, "Thus you are to be holy to me, for I am your Elohim who am holy, and I have set you apart from the people to be mine." We are called to be ministers, as we see it in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. It says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for Elohim's own possession, that you may proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." May the Eternal help us to become that nation that is not composed of a literal descendants of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, but that we can become the celestial nation of Israel that is truly set apart, that truly fulfilled this calling of living in integrity, living in holiness, which means set apart, fidelity, and doing justice as the Eternal is expecting for all of us to be. And thank you so much. This is the end of our study. Thank you so much for your attention. And if the Eternal gives us life, and may He help us to continue to be and live up to the expectations that the Eternal has for us. And if He gives us more life, I shall see you in another video. Shalom.